Daniel Carter knew something was wrong long before he admitted it to himself. The realization didn't come with shouting or slammed doors. It came quietly, the way most painful truths do. Sunday dinner at the house in Cedar Ridge looked the same as it always had. The oak table was polished. The plates were warm. The smell of rosemary chicken filled the air. Marion Carter moved between the kitchen and dining room with careful energy, while Thomas Carter poured drinks and asked casual questions about the week. Leela sat across from Daniel, glowing under the soft kitchen lights. She was mid-story when Daniel tuned back in. "And then he actually said I should just follow my heart," Leela laughed. "Can you believe that?" Marion leaned forward immediately. "Oh, sweetheart, that's wonderful. How do you feel about it?" Thomas smiled at her. "You deserve someone who sees how special you are." Daniel watched the exchange, the way their eyes softened, the way their voices changed. He cleared his throat. "I actually had a meeting this week about a promotion." No one looked at him. Forks scraped plates. Marion nodded absently while still watching Leela. "That's nice, Daniel." Thomas shifted in his chair. "Leela, did you decide about the studio space?" The conversation drifted away from him, as if he hadn't spoken at all. Daniel felt the familiar tightening in his chest. It wasn't anger. It was something smaller and heavier. He picked at his food. Marion stood and spooned another serving onto Leela's plate. "You barely ate anything, honey. You need to keep your strength." "I'm fine, Mom," Leela said softly, but she didn't move the plate away. Daniel glanced at his own half-empty plate. No one asked if he wanted more. It shouldn't have mattered. It was just food, just small talk. But it wasn't just that. It was everything. Thomas wiped his mouth and cleared his throat. "We've actually been meaning to talk about something important." Marion straightened. Leela's expression turned curious but calm, like she was already prepared for good news. Daniel felt something cold settle under his ribs. Thomas continued, "Your mother and I have been reviewing our savings. We've decided it's time to use it in a way that makes sense." Marion reached for Leela's hand. "We want to give it to you, sweetheart, so you can have a fresh start. No stress, no pressure." Leela blinked. "Wait, all of it." Thomas nodded. "You need stability. We want you secure." Daniel stared at them. He waited for the second half of the sentence, the part where his name would be mentioned. It never came. He swallowed. "Did you consider splitting it?" The room went still. Marion's jaw tightened. "Daniel, this isn't about splitting things. Your sister needs us more right now." Thomas sighed. "You've always been independent. You handle things." "I'm not saying she doesn't deserve help," Daniel said carefully. "I'm just asking if I was ever part of the plan." Leela finally looked at him. "I get why you might feel uncomfortable," she said gently, "but they're just trying to do what's best." Daniel let out a short breath. "What's best for who?" Marion's voice sharpened. "Don't turn this into something ugly." "I'm not," he replied. "I'm just asking a question." Thomas shook his head. "This is exactly what we didn't want. We don't need drama." "Drama," Daniel repeated, stunned. "You're being selfish," Marion said quietly, as if delivering a diagnosis. The word hit him harder than he expected. "Selfish?" He almost laughed. "For years," he began, his voice steady but tight, "I've handled everything on my own. I never asked for help with tuition. I never asked for rent money. I never asked." "Because you didn't need it," Thomas interrupted. "That doesn't mean I didn't matter." Silence. Leela looked down at her plate. Marion exhaled slowly. "You're strong, Daniel. That's something to be proud of." He stared at her. Being strong shouldn't mean being invisible. No one responded. The moment passed the way all uncomfortable moments did in that house. It dissolved without resolution. Thomas reached for his glass. "The decision is final." Just like that. Conversation resumed in fragments. Leela spoke softly about potential plans. Marion asked about timelines. Thomas discussed logistics. Daniel's voice disappeared from the table entirely. He stood after a few minutes. "I'm not feeling great. I'm going to head out." Marion didn't look up. "Drive safe." Thomas nodded once. Leela offered a small wave. "Text me when you get home." He stepped outside into the cool Cedar Ridge night. The air felt sharper than usual. Inside his car, He sat with his hands on the steering wheel. He didn't cry. He didn't shout. He just replayed the word. Selfish. The engine hummed to life. As he pulled away from the house, he felt something inside him shift. Not anger. Not heartbreak. Something quieter. Acceptance. He wasn't part of the plan. Maybe he never had been. And for the first time, instead of trying to earn his way back into that circle, Daniel wondered what would happen if he simply stopped trying. Daniel drove in silence, the streets of Cedar Ridge empty under the soft glow of streetlights. He didn't know where he was going. Part of him wanted to escape, to forget, to erase the memories of a table where he had always been invisible. But another part of him wanted to feel the weight of it fully, to understand exactly what had been happening all those years. He thought back to his childhood, birthdays that barely registered, gifts that seemed hastily bought or forgotten. He remembered sitting on the floor of the living room blowing out a candle while Marion smiled distractedly at Leela's next move. Leela's birthdays were always an event. The decorations, the small gatherings, the care taken to make her feel special, it had been consistent, deliberate, intentional. He had told himself it didn't matter. He had told himself he was fine with less attention. But the truth was, it had stung quietly, persistently, like a dull ache you couldn't rub away. At school, Daniel had been diligent. Straight A's, awards in small competitions, no trouble with teachers. He had hoped even subconsciously that his parents would notice, would beam with pride. But the response had always been minimal. A nod, a "that's nice," quickly followed by a question about Leela. When Leela struggled, tutors appeared and patience ran thin from the parents' pockets. When Daniel struggled, he figured it out on his own, taught himself lessons no one asked him to learn. By the time they became adults, Daniel had learned to hold everything inside. He had learned that speaking up, asking for support, or showing vulnerability wasn't rewarded. And now, in the car, he realized he had been carrying that invisible weight into the present, shaping who he had become. When he reached Hollow Brook, his apartment felt welcoming in a way the family home never had. The quiet wasn't lonely, it was calm. It was his. He poured himself a glass of water and sat on the edge of the couch, staring at the dim city lights filtering through the window. He let the tension sink into the cushions and fade slowly, giving way to thought instead of anger. He thought about Leela, always charming, always quick to win attention, always relying on their parents' support. She hadn't asked for help that night, hadn't pushed for compromise. She had simply accepted. That realization didn't fill him with resentment, at least not entirely. Instead, he felt the truth of their dynamic. She never needed to fight for attention, and he never received it without asking. Their roles had been set long before he understood them. Daniel replayed the dinner in his mind, each sentence, each gesture. Marion's soft sigh when he asked a question. Thomas's impatience disguised as calm reason. Leela's gentle acknowledgement, which felt like a dismissal wrapped in kindness. The memory didn't sting as sharply as it had while it was happening. It made him see clearly how he had learned endurance, how he had been shaped by quiet neglect into someone self-reliant and cautious. Days passed. Daniel focused on his work, the quiet routines of Hollow Brook providing a rhythm that no one could disrupt. He didn't call his parents. He didn't replay conversations with friends. He simply showed up at the office, returned home, and allowed himself to rest in the autonomy he had earned. Leela continued her life in Cedar Ridge. Occasionally, he heard bits through social media, photos of trips funded by their parents, updates about projects he would have once advised on, financial support flowing into new ventures. She moved quickly, tried things that didn't always last, but she had a safety net that cushioned her falls. He didn't feel jealousy, he felt clarity. Their paths were different, and that difference was natural. The stability he built required patience, caution, and discipline. Leela's comfort required nothing of her but acceptance. Weeks later, Daniel received an unexpected message from Marion. "We need to talk. Could you come by?" He hesitated before replying. Part of him wanted to ignore it. Part of him knew he wouldn't. Something in the phrasing, the careful, measured tone, suggested the dynamic was changing. When he arrived, he found the tension in the room immediate. Leela sat rigidly on the couch, her hands folded, avoiding his gaze. Marion and Thomas exchanged quiet, unspoken glances. We don't really know what to do anymore," Marion began slowly, her voice faltering. "Things have gotten complicated." Daniel stayed silent, listening. He didn't interject, didn't demand explanations. He simply let the words land. Leela shifted uncomfortably, realizing this conversation wasn't about her. Thomas continued, "We've always counted on your judgment. You're calm, your ability to see clearly when situations get messy. Daniel's chest tightened slightly, not from pride but from understanding. Their reliance was no longer about favoritism, it was necessity. Leela had faltered, and they were reaching for the one they had overlooked. "We know we made mistakes," Marion said. "We hoped you could help to guide, to advise." Her eyes searched his, but he didn't respond immediately. She paused, then added, We need your stability right now." Daniel leaned back, the weight of years settling around him. He could step in, take on the familiar role, fix what had been broken for years. Or he could protect the life he had built, the stability he had earned through patience, discipline, and quiet self-reliance. He felt the power in the choice. For the first time, the decision didn't belong to anyone else but him. Leela stayed silent the entire time, her silence heavier than words. Daniel understood that for once she wasn't the center. For once he held the balance. He didn't answer immediately. He simply allowed the pause to stretch, feeling the clarity of the moment settle around him like a shield. This wasn't about revenge or anger or proving a point. This was about protecting what he had built, valuing his own life, and recognizing the limits of his involvement in a family that had never chosen him first. The room was quiet, and in that quiet, Daniel felt a strength he had never acknowledged before. He could choose, and his choice would not be dictated by guilt or obligation. Daniel finally spoke, his voice calm, measured, carrying the weight of years of restraint. "I care about you all," he said. "I always have, but I won't step into the same role I've always been expected to fill." Marion's brows furrowed. "Daniel, we just need your help. We don't want to lose control of things." "I understand," he replied evenly. "But control isn't mine to take. I can give advice when asked. I can share what I know. I can guide. But I won't manage anyone's problems anymore. I won't put my stability at risk. I won't be the safety net that was never there for me." Thomas blinked, slightly startled. We never realized." "You did realize," Daniel said softly but firmly. "You chose her and I accepted it for years. I carried my role quietly. I made my own life work while supporting a system that ignored me. I won't do it again." Leela shifted in her seat, her posture rigid. She didn't speak, didn't protest, didn't ask him to change his mind. For once, she wasn't being protected. For once, the safety she had always relied on wasn't automatic. Daniel could see the unease in her eyes, the recognition that things weren't going to return to the way they'd always been. Marion exhaled slowly, trying to mask her surprise. We didn't expect this." "I never said it was punishment," Daniel said. "These are boundaries. They are meant to protect me and the life I've built. You've relied on me for too long. That stops now. That doesn't mean I don't care. It doesn't mean I'm angry. It means I know my worth and I choose how to give it." Thomas ran a hand over his face. We always thought you understood. You handled things so well, we took it for granted." Daniel nodded, letting their words settle. "You did, and now you know. I won't erase the past, and I won't let it dictate my present. My choices are mine." The room fell silent, the kind of silence that carried weight but not tension. No one raised their voice. No one made accusations. The conversation had shifted. Daniel had shifted it. Leela finally looked up at him, her eyes uncertain. "So, you're not going to help?" "I'll help when it's reasonable," he said, keeping his tone neutral but steady. "I'll give advice if asked. I'll support where it doesn't endanger me, but I won't step into the role I was never meant to play. Not anymore." She nodded slowly, understanding dawning in the quiet. She didn't like it. She didn't argue. She didn't push back. It was unfamiliar territory, and she realized the automatic support she had always counted on wasn't coming from him this time. Marion and Thomas exchanged a look, recognition finally softening their features. They hadn't expected this. They had assumed their oldest son would always bend, always accommodate, always sacrifice himself. For the first time, they understood that their favoritism had consequences beyond simple neglect. It had built a wall of independence in Daniel, a wall that wasn't easily broken down. Daniel felt light, not proud, not vindicated, just light. Setting these boundaries hadn't taken anything from him. It had given him something immeasurable, control over his own life, over his own choices. He wasn't responsible for fixing what he didn't break. He wasn't obligated to restore balance that had been absent for decades. For the first time, he felt the quiet strength of autonomy. After the conversation ended, he left Cedar Ridge, feeling neither anger nor guilt. Leela watched him go, still uncertain, still uneasy, still learning that he wouldn't automatically save her from the consequences she had always escaped. Marion and Thomas remained seated, realizing that the dynamic they had maintained for years was finally shifting, and they would need to navigate a new reality, one where Daniel's presence was no longer guaranteed in the way it had always been. Driving home, Daniel let his thoughts wander. He thought about the dinners, the birthdays, the countless times he had been overlooked, the countless times he had remained silent to keep peace. He realized that endurance and patience had built his strength, but that strength also gave him the clarity to choose himself now. He thought about Leela, not with bitterness, but with clarity. She had always been favored, cushioned, protected. That protection had shaped her in ways Daniel had never experienced. Her mistakes were corrected, her failures mitigated, her life supported. He had learned to navigate without a net, to stand steady without applause, to rely on nothing but his own judgment. The contrast between them didn't breed resentment, it bred understanding. Daniel understood how independence had shaped him, how comfort had shaped her, and how neither path was inherently better, only different. He had grown in ways they hadn't noticed. He had learned self-reliance, discipline, and patience that no one could take away. The night was quiet as he pulled into his apartment complex in Hollow Brook. He sat in the car for a moment, letting the silence surround him. No one had cheered for his decisions. No one had praised his strength. No one had validated the life he had built quietly, carefully, without acknowledgement, and yet he felt complete. Daniel understood that the respect he had longed for from his parents had to come from himself. The loyalty he had given, the patience he had practiced, the endurance he had maintained, these were not diminished because no one had seen them. They existed, tangible and real, in the life he had carved out. For the first time in his life, Daniel didn't wait for recognition. He didn't hope for understanding. He didn't expect someone else to choose him. He had chosen himself. And that choice, quiet, firm, unyielding, was enough. The days that followed were calm, almost deceptively so. Daniel returned to his routines in Hollow Brook, the rhythm of his work and personal life providing a structure that no one could disrupt. He woke early, brewed coffee, reviewed his schedules, and moved through each day deliberately. There was a new ease in his movements, a quiet confidence that had nothing to do with recognition or applause. He was no longer acting in the shadows of Cedar Ridge. He was living in a space where he determined the terms. News of Leela's struggles trickled through occasional phone calls and social media posts. She had made mistakes. Financial decisions rushed and unplanned, ventures started without caution. Daniel didn't feel triumph or schadenfreude. He only observed. He saw the pattern unfold, familiar yet distant, and understood what years of dependence had created. His parents, who had always swooped in to smooth her path, now sounded weary when recounting the challenges. Their voices carried exhaustion and subtle frustration. They were no longer effortlessly able to protect her from every consequence. One evening, Marion called. Her voice was careful, deliberate, as though she weighed each word before saying it. "Daniel, we could use your advice. Things are more complicated than we expected." Daniel listened, silent, letting the weight of her words settle. Leela remained quiet in the background, stiff and aware. For once, she wasn't the center of the room's focus. For once, she wasn't being shielded from difficulty. Daniel recognized the shift immediately. The roles were beginning to reverse, not out of vindication, but out of reality. He took a measured breath. "I'll help," he said. "I can provide guidance, suggest options, but I won't take over. I won't manage anyone else's responsibilities. I won't sacrifice my stability for problems that aren't mine to fix." There was a pause, long and heavy. Marion exhaled. Thomas's hand rested over his face, a gesture that betrayed surprise. We've always assumed you would," Thomas started, then stopped, as though realizing the words would reveal too much about years of blind expectation. "I've always adapted," Daniel said. "I've always carried the weight quietly, but adaptation isn't endless. Independence isn't a ticket to be taken for granted. I'm responsible for myself first, and that's not selfish. It's necessary." The room was still. Leela's eyes met his for a brief moment, uncertain, uncomfortable. She had been accustomed to automatic support, to a network that rescued her without question. Now she faced a boundary she hadn't encountered before. Daniel wasn't just stating rules. He was demonstrating that the safety net she relied on wasn't going to appear by default. The conversation didn't erupt in anger or shouting. There were no accusations, no emotional appeals, just a quiet understanding settling into the space. Daniel realized that the power he had long envied, visibility, influence, being chosen, wasn't in their recognition. It was in knowing his own worth and acting on it. Over the next weeks, he maintained this balance. He gave advice when asked. He shared perspectives on decisions, offered insight without taking ownership, and watched as his family adjusted. Leela made mistakes, faced consequences, and learned, sometimes painfully, that support wasn't automatic. Marion and Thomas recognized, slowly, that Daniel's guidance required negotiation and respect, not entitlement. Daniel's own life continued to thrive. The stability he had built, cultivated over years of quiet diligence, allowed him to navigate challenges with confidence. He celebrated victories privately, promotion milestones, personal achievements, financial independence, without the need for acknowledgement. The quiet victories felt more profound than applause could ever provide. Each small success reinforced the clarity he had gained. He didn't need validation to understand his value. He noticed changes in his parents over time. They asked questions they hadn't before about budgets, career decisions, and long-term plans. Their tone carried curiosity instead of expectation. There was respect in their hesitations, a recognition that Daniel's autonomy was no longer negotiable. It didn't erase the past, but it subtly shifted the present. Daniel observed Leela with a measured detachment. He no longer compared paths. Her dependence, her mistakes, and her reliance on their parents contrasted with his self-sufficiency, but he didn't feel resentment. He understood the shaping force of different experiences. Comfort had created a fragile confidence in her. Discipline had created a quiet, unshakable resilience in him. There was no superiority in this awareness, only clarity. Late one night, Daniel reflected on the years he had spent seeking acknowledgement that never came. He remembered the countless times he had measured worth through the eyes of others, and he felt a quiet satisfaction in the knowledge that he had outgrown that need. The endurance that once felt like obligation now felt like preparation. He had learned responsibility and independence long before they were rewarded, and that knowledge was irrevocable. In Hollow Brook, Daniel lived in the space he had chosen, free from the pressures that had shaped his younger self. The quiet was no longer lonely, it was protective. It allowed him to grow, to define his own boundaries, to see clearly the difference between support given freely and support demanded. The clarity brought peace. Daniel understood that he had changed the rules not by confrontation, not by anger, but simply by choosing himself. The respect he had sought from his family was no longer a prerequisite for his own self-worth. His endurance, patience, and discipline had created a life untouchable by favoritism, a life built carefully on the foundation of his own effort. And in that understanding, Daniel felt a profound stillness, a quiet victory that no one else could acknowledge but that he could feel completely. Time passed, and the changes Daniel had quietly set in motion began to take shape. Leela's struggles deepened. Ventures she had rushed into without thought faltered, financial gaps widened, and the safety net she had always relied upon began to fray. Her dependence, once so effortless, now demanded patience and guidance that wasn't automatic. Marion and Thomas called more frequently, their voices tired, edged with the kind of concern that comes from realizing consequences cannot be avoided. Daniel listened, calm and deliberate. He offered measured advice when asked, questions that guided Leela to consider outcomes, and suggestions that encouraged her to take responsibility for her own choices. He didn't step in to correct, fix, or shield her. He resisted the old impulse to save, the urge to carry problems that weren't his. With every conversation, he felt the quiet power of his choice. He could help, yes, but only on his terms. Leela noticed the change. At first, she tried the old ways, pleading subtly, hinting at urgency, expecting Daniel to step in. When he didn't, frustration appeared on her face, tight and restrained. Her dependence, once effortless, now required negotiation. She realized slowly that the rules had shifted, and Daniel's consistency made them unbreakable. Marion and Thomas grew quieter, not out of anger, but out of realization. The son they had overlooked for so long was no longer a pliable safety net. Their trust in Daniel's judgment had always been there, but now it came with limits, and that discomfort forced them to see what they had never acknowledged, that their choices had consequences, and Daniel had the authority to decide how much involvement he allowed. Daniel reflected on his journey in long stretches of quiet evenings. He thought about the years spent waiting for validation, the endless cycles of effort met with minimal acknowledgement. He thought about the slow accumulation of small victories, paying bills on time, advancing in his career, building a life free from reliance on anyone else. That quiet accumulation, once unseen, had become his anchor. He understood fully that the independence he had cultivated was itself a form of wealth, richer than the financial support given to Leela. The first time he realized Leela had truly understood came months later. She called him one evening, her voice subdued, tinged with humility he hadn't heard before. "Daniel, I think I finally get it," she said softly. "I've relied too much on everyone else. I see now that you've always carried yourself differently. I didn't notice because it was never dramatic. It was steady, quiet, and I—" Daniel cut her off gently. "It's not about noticing. It's about understanding. You can't rely on someone else to give you what you haven't built yourself. I've learned that. You're learning it too." She paused, swallowing hard. "I'm trying, I really am." "I know," he said, "and I can help you learn, but I won't take over. That's the boundary. That's how you grow." Even Leela's acknowledgement didn't fill Daniel with pride or satisfaction. It was simply clarity reinforced. The lessons he had lived through, the endurance he had practiced, had culminated in this moment, an understanding of balance, responsibility, and self-respect. His parents began to adjust to the new reality. Calls became questions instead of directives. Their voices were edged with humility rather than expectation. Daniel provided insight when asked, yet he remained unmoved by guilt or obligation. He had built patience, and patience allowed him to observe without reaction, to guide without entanglement, to care without losing himself. Daniel's life flourished in parallel. Professional milestones, personal projects, and small domestic victories accumulated quietly. There were no announcements, no celebrations shared with those who had ignored him for so long. Each success strengthened the sense of self he had built independently, proof that recognition was unnecessary for achievement. The quiet, once oppressive, had become protective, empowering, and grounding. Years later, Daniel understood the full measure of his journey. The favoritism he had endured had not broken him. It had shaped him, refined him, taught him endurance, patience, and discipline. Leela's reliance had never diminished his worth. It had clarified it. He had learned the value of restraint, the importance of boundaries, and the quiet, unyielding power of self-choice. He remembered the Sundays of his youth, the subtle neglect, the whispered dismissals, the invisible weight of being overlooked. Those memories no longer carried bitterness. They carried lessons. Endurance had become clarity. Silence had become strength. What once felt like absence had forged a life defined not by what he lacked, but by what he built with his own hands. The quiet victories, the personal boundaries, the steady self-reliance, these were Daniel. He had chosen himself when no one else did, and that choice resonated louder than any praise or approval ever could. He walked through life knowing his value, respecting his limits, and accepting that loyalty and love are not always reciprocated, but self-respect is always within reach. In the end, Daniel didn't need applause. He didn't need recognition. The life he had built, the independence he had claimed, and the peace he had earned were more than enough. Leela learned to stand, Marion and Thomas learned to see, and Daniel, finally, learned that waiting to be chosen was no longer necessary. He had chosen himself. And that choice, quiet, steady, and unshakable, was everything. Months passed, and life continued in its steady rhythm. Daniel had grown accustomed to the quiet power of his boundaries. The world of Cedar Ridge felt distant now, like a place he once inhabited but no longer belonged to. He still kept an eye on Leela through subtle updates and occasional conversations, but the compulsion to intervene had long disappeared. He had discovered a new rhythm, one where his own life came first, where his peace was preserved, and where his energy was reserved for the choices he made deliberately. One Saturday, a call came from Thomas. His voice carried fatigue and hesitation. "Daniel, we need your help again. Things have gotten worse than we anticipated." Daniel leaned back, letting the words settle before responding. "I'll listen. I can offer guidance, but I won't take control. That's not my role anymore." There was a long pause. "We understand," Thomas admitted quietly. We were hoping you could step in like before." "I can't," Daniel said firmly, but without anger. "I've spent years doing what you expected. I've built a life where I'm responsible for myself first. That responsibility doesn't extend to fixing what you neglected. I can advise, I can support. I won't carry the weight you didn't see." Hanging up, Daniel felt the familiar clarity of his choice. No guilt, no anger, just peace. He realized that this was the ultimate lesson of his journey. Endurance had given him strength, patience had given him perspective, and detachment had given him freedom. He was no longer bound by the roles others assigned him. He had become the architect of his own life, unshaken by favoritism, unblinded by neglect, and guided solely by his own sense of worth. Later that evening, he visited Hollow Brook Park. The crisp air filled his lungs as he walked along the quiet paths, the city lights reflected in the pond, glimmering like distant stars. Daniel thought about the journey he had traveled, From the invisible child at family dinners to the independent man sitting under the night sky, fully aware of his value. The ache of neglect had transformed into wisdom. The quiet of invisibility had shaped resilience. The favoritism that once caused pain had revealed clarity. A message from Leela appeared on his phone. "Can we talk?" He considered ignoring it. He considered setting limits as he had before. But something in the wording struck him, humility perhaps, or genuine understanding. He replied simply, "Yes, tomorrow let's meet." The next day, in a quiet cafe tucked in a corner of Cedar Ridge, they sat facing each other. Leela's eyes were softer than he remembered, tinged with vulnerability. "Daniel, I've been thinking," she began, voice careful. "I've relied on them my whole life, and I never realized, I never really understood what you went through. I see it now, though, everything you built for yourself, everything you carried quietly." Daniel listened, calm. "It wasn't about being noticed," he said gently. "It was about responsibility and learning to stand on my own. That was my path, you had yours." "I see that now," Leela admitted. I've made mistakes. I've leaned on them too much and on you too without considering your limits. I'm trying to change that." Daniel nodded, acknowledging her words without letting them sway him. "You can't rely on anyone else to give you what you haven't built yourself. That's the lesson. I can guide you. I can offer perspective, but growth has to be your responsibility. You have to own it." For the first time, there was a subtle shift between them. The automatic hierarchy, the unspoken expectation of rescue had dissolved. Leela's dependence, once effortless, now required reflection and accountability. And Daniel, for the first time in his life, was free to observe, guide, and care without sacrificing himself. Returning home, Daniel felt the quiet triumph of choice. Not vengeance, not resentment, but the quiet power of agency. He realized that he had spent years being molded by neglect and favoritism, but now he was shaping his own reality. His life was no longer contingent on approval, acknowledgement, or being chosen. He had chosen himself. Daniel's journey had taught him more than resilience. It had taught him clarity, boundaries, patience, and self-respect. He understood now that favoritism doesn't define value, and neglect doesn't determine worth. Independence, discipline, and self-reliance are cultivated in the spaces left empty by others' choices. That night, Daniel sat on his balcony, watching the city lights flicker like distant fires. He thought of his parents, of Leela, of all the dinners and moments where he had felt unseen. None of it carried the sting it once did. He had learned to walk away without guilt, to set limits without anger, to choose himself without apology. The quiet victories, the daily achievements, the life built patiently and steadily, these were the true markers of worth. The endurance of years spent unnoticed had become clarity. The years of subtle pain had become strength. The favoritism that had once caused shame had revealed the freedom of independence. Daniel smiled softly to himself. He didn't need recognition from anyone. He didn't need validation from those who had overlooked him. The person who mattered most, the one he had finally chosen to protect, was himself. And in that choice, steady, deliberate, unshakable, he found peace, empowerment, and the closure he had sought unknowingly all his life. He had stopped waiting to be chosen. He had chosen himself. The night was calm. The city hummed softly below. Daniel felt complete.